As many of you know, this academic year marks the 10th anniversary of the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. And so we've been showcasing throughout this year our own faculty, including this evening's presenter. A native of Chicago, Sister Margaret Guider holds a graduate degree in education and taught in the inner city of Chicago until 1975, when she responded to a call to become a lay missioner in the rural interior of Brazil. 4 years later, after she returned to the United States, she became a Franciscan sister and soon found herself again back in Chicago, ministering as the Archdiocesan Director of Mission Education and as chaplain to the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. Sister Guider holds a master's in theology from Catholic Theological Union and a Doctor of Theology degree from Harvard University. In 1990, she joined the faculty of Western Jesuit School of Theology and currently serves the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as an associate professor of missiology, and she's also chair of the Ecclesiastical faculty. She's a very popular teacher here at the STM, and her teaching interests include ecclesiology, with a focus on global Catholicism, world mission studies, contextual theology, Mariology, and the consecrated life. Currently, Sister Guider is working on a manuscript entitled With Hearts Broken Open, U.S. Franciscan Missionaries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, 1879 to 2009. She's co-editor of The Grace of Medellin, History, Theology, and Legacy, and editor of Doing What Is Ours to Do, A Clarion Theology of Life. She's a person of generous service. She's been past president of the American Society of Missiology, a trustee of the University of St. Francis and Siena College, and an advisor and consultant to numerous religious institutions and missionary societies, as well as a board member for various Catholic institutions. Sister Guider is member of the Sisters of St. Francis of Mary Immaculate of Joliet, Illinois, and served as her congregation vice president and counselor for mission in 2008 to 2012. As a sister of St. Francis, Sister Guider embraces the gospel way of life in her work and in person, and accepts the challenge Jesus first gave Francis of Assisi: go rebuild my church. Please join me in welcome Sister Meg Guider speak on Confronting the Soul-Devouring Dragon, Sexual Abuse, and the Mystery of Evil. Meg.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am honored by your presence and amazed by the fascination that we all have with evil, as displayed in this significant crowd this evening. Well, as you know, the topic is Confronting the Soul-Devouring Dragon, Sexual Abuse, and the Mystery of Evil. As communities of faith throughout the world grapple with multiple factors that contribute to sexual abuse, much of the discourse on the subject focuses on analyses of power relations, socio-cultural conditions, and psychological pathologies. In this lecture, my focus is on an attribution theory that I often find lacking in more progressive Catholic circles, though admittedly it receives substantial attention in more traditional Catholic circles. Namely, critical theological reflection on the mystery of evil. Specifically, the evil that I will name sexual abuse. While many of us, including myself, have weighed in on the subject from the vantage points of priestly formation, ecclesial structures of accountability, the clerical culture of secrecy, the lack of transparency, a more explicit discussion about the mystery of evil as manifested in the phenomenon of sexual abuse has been less prominent. This being said, I would like to begin this evening's reflection with a thought experiment and a what-if question. So, what if? Where would we be as a church and a society today if, when bishops, priests, religious women and men, lay ecclesial leaders, theologians, and the whole people of God began to become attentive to clergy sexual abuse? We would have expanded our resources and energies not only on addressing the reality ad intra, but would have made a concerted, broad-based effort ad extra to make explicit the connections between clergy sexual abuse and the much more widespread reality of sexual abuse in society. What if we had named this mystery of evil and taken action in the form of attention, intercession, intervention, and prevention within and across nations and cultures in which the church is present and the cross of Jesus Christ is witnessed and proclaimed? The short version of that long what-if question is, what if we had simply made the connections between clergy sexual abuse that raised our consciousness, and we turned that attention to help us understand the magnitude of the reality of evil in sexual abuse that pervades multiple societies, multiple nations, multiple cultures, in which the church has agency and power. Yes, where would we be today? This thought experiment highlights what we have yet to do as a church. My hope is that this presentation may advance the conviction that it is never too late to be courageous in confronting the soul-devouring dragon of sexual abuse, not only within the church, but also within the world. So, the image that brought you all here. Saint Margaret and the Dragon. Just to be clear, I was named after Saint Margaret of Scotland. To the extent that the image is insight and legends are windows to the world, allow me to share with you the story of Saint Margaret of Antioch of Pisidia, also known in the East as Saint Marina the Great Martyr, and her confrontation with the dragon. If you've never heard of Saint Margaret, it well may be because her cult was suppressed by Pope Paul VI in 1969. According to legend, she died in July of 304 at the age of 15. Though now considered apocryphal, she was popularized in the 13th century in the Golden Legend and later counted among the 14 Holy Helpers, a popular devotion that began at the time of the Black Death. Pursued by a Roman official, Margaret refused his sexual advances and his demands that she renounce her Christian faith. As a consequence, she was arrested, brutally tortured in public, and imprisoned. It is in the context of her imprisonment that she confronted the devil, who appeared to her in the form of a dragon that assaulted her. There are two versions to what transpired next. In one version, she confronts the dragon and vanquishes the dragon with the sign of the cross. In the other version, she is devoured by the dragon, but by the power of the cross, she manages to split open the belly and escape destruction. Still, the legend prevailed, despite its obvious apocryphal nature. But sentenced to death, attempts at immolation and drowning failed. Witnesses to Margaret's miraculous survival converted and subsequently were persecuted and killed. Ultimately, Margaret was beheaded. It goes without saying that the image engaged my imagination. Just look at the eyes. And as evidenced tonight, I suspect it may have engaged your theological imaginations as well. But what is the takeaway as we consider Margaret, her confrontation with the soul-devouring dragon, and the power of the cross of Christ? Perhaps the preface of Gaudium et Spes expresses it best in the claim, "We are emancipated now by Christ, who was crucified and rose again to break the stranglehold of personified evil, so that the world might be fashioned anew, according to God's design, and reach its fulfillment." So what's in a title? Well, the title of this reflection is intended to express in the most concise way possible my four main concerns. So starting with the term mystery of evil. The concept of the mysterium iniquitatis has been the subject of theological and philosophical inquiry for centuries. In his well-known work, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl described the phenomenon as that dimension of evil which remains inexplicable inasmuch as it cannot be fully traced back to biological, sociological, or psychological factors. One of my four concerns in this presentation is to call attention to this mystery of evil, not the problem that envisions a solution, but the mystery, understood as a religious truth that one can know only by revelation and cannot fully understand. The mystery and its significance for the church at this moment in time. It seems, at least to me, that in recent decades, we have devoted ourselves to what has been described as the process of unnaming evil. So think for a moment of something which in the past would have been named evil, which today is unnamed and renamed something else. Let's just take a minute, and if you'd share with the person next to you an evil that has been unnamed and renamed in your life experience. And let me just read very quickly this quotation next to a photo of Germanwings Flight 9525. "We can't seem to acknowledge the depth of evil when, even as in the plane crash, it passes graphically before our eyes. The mysterium iniquitatis, which accounts for a lot more without setting out on the hopeless errand of trying to explain. To turn what is by nature a mystery into some problem that can be remedied by better pilot screening, different flight procedures, or more funding for psychological research." As Andrew Del Bianco observes in his book, The Death of Satan, How Americans Have Lost the Sense of Evil, a gulf has opened up in our culture between the visibility of evil and the intellectual resources available for coping with it. The repertoire of evil has never been richer, Yet never have our responses been so weak. When some shocking new cruelty does seize our attention, we shudder or we wince. Then we switch the channel. We no longer have a conception of evil as a distributed entity with an ontological essence of its own. Yet something that feels like this force still invades our experience. We feel something that our culture, and I dare to say perhaps our eschatology, no longer gives us the vocabulary to express. While some may hesitate to name the phenomenon of sexual abuse as a manifestation of evil, the kind of evil that has an ontological essence of its own, I would argue, on the contrary, that our interest in this subject reinforces, in a way, this claim that I want to make. The second of my 4 concerns is the multifaceted phenomenon of sexual abuse, an umbrella term that covers a vast horizon of sexual violation, violence, and dehumanization. In defining sexual abuse, I rely on the description adapted from that given by the American Psychological Association, based upon the Encyclopedia of Psychology. Sexual abuse is unwanted sexual activity and sexually abusive behaviors involving sexual interaction between persons of any ages, with perpetrators using force, aggressive, exploitative, manipulative, against the victim's will, making threats or taking advantage of victims not able to give consent. Most victims and perpetrators know each other. Immediate reactions to sexual abuse include shock, fear, disbelief. Long-term symptoms include anxiety, fear, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But this definition doesn't begin to capture the complexities of the phenomenon, its collateral effects, and its magnitude in terms of consequences, proximate and remote. Movies, books, reports, legal proceedings, and personal testimonies are abundantly available, and they have been for some time. But what difference has such knowledge made when faced with the statistics from the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the United Nations? By way of one example, consider these statistics from the National Children's Advocacy Center. 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before the age of 18. 1 in 5 children are solicited sexually while on the internet. 20% of children are sexually abused before the age of 8. 90% of children are abused by a family member or someone they know and trust. 60% of child sexual abuse victims never tell anyone. My third of 4 concerns is the manifestation of evil I have chosen to identify metaphorically as the soul-devouring dragon. However, thanks to a doctoral student, I want to add a few additions here, and I believe he's here this evening. I need to preface this definition by first explaining what I mean by soul. I am not referring to a Platonic dualism where the body is separate from the soul. Rather, I am using the term in the Thomistic sense that places emphasis on the body-soul unity, where the soul is understood as the form of the body. In this sense, the adjective soul-devouring is defined as the capacity to consume with the intent to digest and destroy the human being in its entirety. With special reference to the sexual abuse of children, Richard Sipe describes this reality as soul murder, the consequences of which include a loss of faith, the legacy of anxiety, alcohol and drug abuse, sexual identity confusion, PTSD, low self-esteem, poor body image, depression and thoughts of suicide, phobias, panic episodes, obsessions, compulsions, irrational anger, trauma, trust forever betrayed, fundamental abandonment, personalities torn, divorce, separation, alienation, hollowness. Let's look back at those statistics. Children grow up into adults. As for the dragon, let me be clear that this dragon to which I refer, seen here as a mythical monster, a giant reptile, is symbolic, a symbolic manifestation of evil, the evil of child sexual abuse. This dragon does not symbolize those manifestations of evil that are subtle, elusive, invisible, shape-shifting in ways that make evil seductively unrecognizable as it masquerades as good. No, this dragon, this symbol of evil, like the evil of child sexual abuse, is obvious, visible, recognizable, and verifiable. It doesn't pretend to be what it's not. And my fourth concern is described in the word confronting. It means an embodied action that must be taken against a force or power, natural or supernatural, that can no longer be avoided. It is an action that carries with it the possibility of endangerment, affliction, and the threat of violence. It is an action that requires courage. A practical theological reflection on sexual abuse. For any of you familiar with method and practical theology, it begins with experience, and out of that experience, questions arise and emerge that challenge our theological understandings. So let us move on to sexual abuse and the mystery of evil. I first became interested in this subject during the 1980s. And if anybody should say, gee, I don't know, I didn't have anything to read in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, actually, a woman named Marie Fortune gave us plenty to read. Plenty, Plenty, all right? As a doctoral student at Harvard Divinity School, I came across her work on sexual violence. Her work was of interest to me on 5 accounts. My experience as an inner-city special education teacher in a Chicago public school, where I came to learn of the sexual abuse of one of my students. My contact with women involved in prostitution during my years as a lay missionary in Brazil, and the violent rapes and murders of the 4 church women in El Salvador, which were only reflective of the rapes and murders of thousands of other Salvadoran women, children. My work with incarcerated adolescent girls who were victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and my accompaniment of an adult friend abused by a family member. Now, I wrote a book called Daughters of Rahab. It was on prostitution in the Church of Liberation in Brazil. And I want to make reference to that work because of this. This sincerely held fiction by liberation theologians and advocates of a special pastoral ministry for marginalized women. Their sincerely held fiction went something like this. Women and girls become involved in prostitution because of poverty. Question. Then why aren't all poor women and girls prostitutes? Answer. Because all poor women and girls have not been sexually abused as children and adolescents by their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, cousins, neighbors, classmates, or as adolescents and adults by their employers, co-workers, priests, ministers, etc. This was the response given by Gabriela Silva da Leite, the founder of the National Workers' Union of Prostitutes in Brazil. Fact, many poor women and girls involved in prostitution were victims of sexual abuse as children and adolescents. Just one fact. In the early 1990s, my own growing awareness of clergy sexual abuse in my own Archdiocese of Chicago, along with my knowledge of the work being done to engage bishops in understanding the gravity and magnitude of clergy sex abuse, I put these headlines out there for anybody that wants to say, gee, I didn't know anything about this till the crisis broke in Boston. Okay. 1992, inquiry into Chicago breaks silence on sex abuse by Catholic priests. An article in the New York Times by Peter Steinfeld. U.S. bishops meeting to discuss pedophile priests. 100,000 victims, one estimate says. 1973, Baltimore Sun. Jason Berry in the Los Angeles Times in June of 1993. A 1985 internal church document written by an attorney, a priest psychiatrist, and an official of the Vatican Embassy in Washington predicted $1 billion in losses absent a responsive national policy, which still is not in place. 1993. Thanks to the critical journalism of Jason Berry, which began after his investigation of the 1984 reports of the sexual abuse of boys by a priest in rural Louisiana, I was alerted to the phenomenon of sexual abuse internal to the church itself. It became clear to me that sexual abuse was not one among many important ecclesial concerns. It was one to which the church as institution had to pay attention. Seeing, judging, acting on behalf of the people of God was in order. Such attentiveness, however, became more complex given the competing claims for attention in what I'd call the ecclesial arena of consciousness. Indeed, there was sufficient drama surrounding this issue, but keeping it in the center of the arena during the 1990s was more difficult. If you just think of what was going on in the early 1990s, you'll understand why. Now, by 2001, when the Archdiocese of Boston became the epicenter of the clergy sexual abuse scandal, I also became aware of the fact that in 5 different ministerial settings in which I had worked, 5 different priests from diverse backgrounds and cultural contexts were credibly accused. The most difficult thing for me in this process of conscientization was that these 5 men were among the very best priests that I knew, not the worst. They were generous with their time and resources. They were available to meet the needs of God's people in times of emergency, distress, illness, and death. They were attentive to everyone's concerns. By all accounts, inclusive in their practice of ministry and characterized always by a gentle sense of humor. It was this awareness that caused me to pay closer attention to the mystery of evil and its manifestations. There was more at work in these situations than the dark triad of the social sciences: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathology could explain. Admittedly, as a missiologist, I have come under the influence of colleagues with their insights and testimonies from local church leaders from around the world, especially those regions where deliverance ministries and spiritual warfare continue to be taken quite seriously and not outrightly dismissed as superstitions of the poor and the undereducated or the religious fanatic. What they spoke of and wrote about resonated with some of my own experiences in Brazil. I began to think more about the adequacy and the appropriateness of our theological responses as theologians to sexual abuse in the broadest sense possible, as well as in a narrower sense regarding clergy child sexual abuse. As I said at the outset, we, meaning theologians, weighed in on a number of related factors, but any discussion about evil seemed to focus on the evil actions of those we expect to choose the good, and those administrators of institutions and systems in which we have placed our trust. Our attributions were psychological, sociological, cultural, educational, anthropological, organizational, political, criminal, pretty much everything but theological. Granted, the where is God's question was in the minds and hearts of many, but wrestling with the problem and the mystery of evil in large measure meant wrestling with the problem of the abusive actions of perpetrators, the devastating consequences for victims and survivors, and the institutional crisis facing parishes, dioceses, and bishops' conferences. While the theodicy question was on the lips of many, I must admit that I was drawn into my southern Italian Calabrian roots, what some might call a very primitive contadini popular religiosity. Thinking about the magnitude of the scandal and its far-reaching consequences, I could not help myself from asking the question, where is Satan? What is the expansiveness of this mystery of evil, and what can we do to confront it, regardless of whether we are outside or inside the belly of the beast? As we review the statistics on sexual abuse, particularly the data related to the sexual abuse of children, it becomes more difficult to hold fast to a positive theological anthropology, to give a reason for the faith that we hold. Such statistics require us to look at the whole of humankind in history and not simply at the actions of individual human beings. What we are observing is a phenomenon that, metaphorically speaking, is devouring souls, and if not destroying them altogether, leaving them wounded in varying degrees. In the U.S., a child is raped every 2 minutes. In Africa, it is every 3 minutes. Every 8 minutes in the U.S., Protective Services responds to a report of sexual abuse. In many countries, it is legal to marry children as young as 12. Today, there are more than 42 million child sexual abuse survivors in the United States alone. So, turning now to eschatology and the mystery of evil. At the time of the Second Vatican Council, some of you may recall, many of you weren't born, a new way of understanding eschatology was introduced. Or, if not introduced, it was becoming more commonly understood. I speak of Catholics who embraced what we believe to be that liberating theological contribution of the Council. We left behind our spiritual ruminations and theological reflections on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. We embraced the new understanding of eschatological hope, and whether conscious or not, of various theologians' influences on these, somehow this thinking was infused into our theological imaginations. For those of us old enough to remember moving from one eschatological vision to another, we were freed from terrorizing visions of hell, the likelihood that we would pass through the purifying fires of purgatory, deep anxiety over the particular judgment of our separated soul, and a prevailing uncertainty about our worthiness to experience the promises of Christ. In the process, our guardian angels, along with the whole angelic chorus, were no longer needed to lead us into paradise. Somehow God alone would draw us into eternal light, where we would behold God face to face, as welcome guests to that Trinitarian table. As the angelic intermediaries and occupants of that middle space between heaven and hell vanished from consciousness, so did Satan and his army of devils and demons, and with them any vestiges of personified evil. Truth be told, the whole middle space disappeared. Dante's Inferno and Purgatorio, along with Milton's Paradise Lost and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, were consigned to the realm of literature. Of course, we still had to deal with the legends of our dearest saints, along with their prayers, spiritual exercises, and discernment of good and evil spirits. For those of you who don't recognize, that's Ignatius combating the demons. And this is Francis of Assisi exorcising demons from the city of Arezzo. But our newfound theological confidence in a that was then and this is now approach to the history of spirituality made it possible for us to disregard or reinterpret through a modern lens that which no longer fit our contemporary eschatology or religious sensibilities. Within 20 years, a new generation of Catholics had little knowledge of what came before eschatological hope. Any reference to the four last things would draw a blank stare or a furrowed brow. You mean like a bucket list? Some might say, mission accomplished. When it comes to evil, many are persuaded that a robust social ethics puts the ball in the court of human beings making individual and collective choices between good and evil. Attributions to evil forces occupying that middle space, no longer recognized by thoroughly modern minds, that overwhelm human beings in ways mysterious and nefarious, fall on deaf ears. How primitive, pre-modern, uneducated, superstitious. But wait a second, how can this be? The authors of the document of all documents informing social ethics, Gaudium et Spes, seem not to have received the memo on eschatological hope. For whatever reason, they remain attuned 17 times to personified evil, supernatural evil forces, and at times the inability of human beings, individually and collectively to resist evil. Confronting the mystery of evil is manifested in the phenomenon of sexual abuse. In Jesus the Liberator, John Sobrino observes, while Judaism knew no individual demons, Jesus stressed the unity of them all in Satan. The evil at work is therefore not the isolated action of individual devils, but something that permeates everything. It is the negative power of creation which destroys it and makes it capable of destroying. The power that was expressed in history and society as the anti-kingdom. Now, mindful of the example of Jesus, I would suggest that one of the ways of confronting this mystery of evil may be understood as a spiritual discipline that would enlarge our capacity for good and for making meaning of affliction, both natural and unnatural, a boldness befitting disciples. Now, I recognize that Pope Francis has come under a great deal of criticism and scrutiny when he asked the Catholic faithful from around the world to get out their missals from 1964 and pray the prayer to St. Michael the Archangel, a prayer that was removed from the liturgy in 1964. Now, the criticisms and critiques were, please, Pope Francis, the devil did not make people do it. It was their choice. It was their decision. It was human agency. However, if we look at the logic of eschatology, it seems that there's a way in which there is a sense in Pope Francis, whether retrieving that prayer form was a good idea or not. It seems that the retrieval of that prayer form drew us into an eschatology that we might say was an eschatology of the past for many. But it seems to me that one of the challenges before us is we have to find ways of holding together the possibility of finding the vocabulary, finding the meaning that will allow us really to engage this mystery of evil. And what I'd like to suggest as possibilities for confrontation include 4 possibilities. The first is attention. The second, intercession. The third, intervention. And the fourth, prevention. In social psychology, there's a study of how problems arise, come into consciousness, and often disappear without a resolution. There's a baseline point at which people become attentive and aware. I would say that baseline point for the church in the United States was 1984, when we became aware of the sex abuse crisis in Louisiana. But as I noted in a previous slide, that initial baseline attention became real attentiveness in 1993. By 2001, we had turned from attentiveness to a full-blown awareness. And that has continued to a great extent, as we move forward now, several years later, 2 decades, to February 2019, where Pope Francis gathers bishops from around the world for a summit on child sexual abuse. One may ask, why did it take so long? The answer might be, well, at least something happened. But what exactly happened? If you go back to my original question, all of these years that we as church have been dealing with the crisis of clergy sexual abuse with regard to children, slow have we been to make the connection to the children in our parishes, our catechism classes, our schools, who are being raped and abused in their own homes. Why have we not made those connections? Ad intra, ad extra, it seems logical that we were in a privileged position to make the connections, and we didn't. As we will note from the summit, another thing that happens in this arena of consciousness, which held the church and the world captive for those days in February, the problem itself begins to fragment. It was at the time of the summit that we learn about the abuse of the sisters in India. When we've known about the sexual abuse of sisters in Africa for at least 3 decades. This is not new news. But then another thing that came up was the children of clergy and relationships of abuse with adult women. The problem fragmented. What began as a concern for children fragmented. When we think about our analyses of problems, I think it's important to keep that fragmentation of the problem in mind. But enough on attention. I think we can say we have repeatedly received wake-up calls. Wake up. Not only wake up in terms of the church, wake up in terms of families and neighborhoods and schools and social relationships. With regard to intercession here, I'm really speaking about the power of prayer, which I think Pope Francis adequately or inadequately was attempting to do, with appeals to pray the rosary and to pray the prayer to St. Michael. But what do we do? How do we look for spiritual guidance, hope, this intercession of forces of grace that could help us in this crisis? And when it comes to intervention, I ask myself, why have we been lacking in so much creativity? Why? We have so many tools with which to intervene. For example, in parishes throughout this country and countries throughout the world, there is always ongoing baptism formation for parents and godparents. When was the last time in a baptismal formation process that somewhere, even for an hour, the subject of child sexual abuse, identifying the signs, was made available to a captive audience of people preparing to baptize their children. What about First Communion? Parents coming forward, another opportunity. Was the opportunity taken? Confirmation, an opportunity to inform not only sponsors and parents, but the adolescents themselves. I'm not talking about pull-away weekends. I'm talking about an hour of intervention. This we can do. When people ask the question, how is it that we can be collaborating in this? And what will the measures of accountability be? These are simple measures. Did you do an hour at baptismal preparation? Did you do an hour at marriage preparation? Did you do an hour at First Communion preparation? Did you do an hour at confirmation? This isn't hard. This is easy. And I turn now to those of you who will be confessors. I don't know how many of you have been to a doctor or a nurse practitioner recently, but you probably heard this question. Do you feel safe at home? You know, as a member of a religious community, a community that I love, you know, when the doctor asked me that question, I'm like, yeah, I feel safe. He responded, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I'm sure. But how many people may respond yes, but deep in their hearts the answer is no? I say to you confessors, which I think I will probably never be in the ordained sense. If the medical profession can do this, is there not a way in the pastoral context of reconciliation that you may ask a penitent, do you feel safe? And provide them with some guidance if they respond as to what they could do? Also, are you in a privileged position to ask the question, do you think that there are times when you have made people feel unsafe? These are things that are doable. We don't have to go up to the heavens and ask somebody to help us bring it down. These are interventions that are possible. And there's more, but I digress, and we have to stay on schedule here. Finally, prevention. Prevention, knowing the signs, listening to people's stories, listening to people's pain. What does it cause us to do? What actions toward prevention can we take? Think of the energy that has been placed in Virtus training, and this is in no way a criticism of Virtus training. But what if we were to carry that out to the larger world? What if this became a graced opportunity for the disciples of Jesus to help make people aware? Not just to obtain a certificate so that they can go on retreats with children, but to actually make a difference in our society. Those statistics that I shared with you are compelling. They are frightening. They reveal, I think, the mystery of evil. But can we be courageous? Can we be courageous in attention, in intercession, in intervention, and in prevention? If the four last things have faded away, and what we embrace is eschatological hope, then I think we also need to pay attention, close attention as we did to those visions of hell and purgatory, uncertain as they may be, to focus on the reality of despair and the reality of presumption that are holding our world, our communities hostage. How is it that we can be those agents of eschatological hope? By helping people to identify those places of despair. For the most part, those are pretty obvious. But the places of presumption are endangering everyone. So in conclusion, I want to say something about hope. And a vision of hope and goodness that helps us to understand the role of courage in confronting the soul-devouring dragon. Do you remember this image from the summer? The Thailand boys and their coach in a cave with the world awaiting, hoping that they would survive. Hoping against hope. What was the reason for their survival? A coach trained as a monk who knew the spiritual exercises of breathing to calm the soul. And in those spiritual exercises, those young boys were given the conditions to stave off fear and anxiety, hopelessness, and despair. If Buddhists have the resources, I suggest that as Christians, we have the resources too. But we have to dig deep and find them. And perhaps they are found and captured in the most grave situations of affliction, natural and unnatural. And so I conclude, hopefully, with a word of hope. May all of us shine as lights among the people of this world as we hold firmly to the message that gives life, the message of hope that we find in the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The message of hope held in the cross with which Margaret confronted the soul-devouring dragon and survived. Thank you.